Bullies vandalize new kid's bike. Bad choice. He was a judo black belt. Kieran Blackwood adjusted his worn backpack as he approached Lincoln High School for the third week running. His slight frame and quiet demeanor had marked him as different among the confident students who navigated these halls like they owned them. With dark hair falling across his forehead and thrift store clothes, Kieran had learned that blending into the background was his safest strategy. Moving from Portland to this California town had been his family's fresh start after his father lost his job, but so far, fresh felt more like brutal. Lincoln High was where social hierarchies were carved in stone, and newcomers either found their place quickly or became targets. The morning sun cast shadows across the parking lot as Kieran locked his second-hand mountain bike near the gymnasium. It wasn't much to look at, with faded paint and mismatched components, but it was reliable transportation and one of the few things he'd brought from his old life. As he straightened up, mocking laughter reached his ears. "Well, well, looks like charity case is here early," came the voice of Tanner Mills, Lincoln High's unofficial king of making lives miserable. Tanner stood 6 feet tall with an athletic build from football and wrestling, his blonde hair perfectly styled and designer clothes advertising his family's wealth. Everything about him screamed entitlement. Flanking Tanner were his sidekicks, Jackson Reed and Braden Foster, both eager to laugh at whatever cruelty their leader dished out. Jackson was stockier with a crew cut and permanent sneer. Braden was taller but lanky, channeling nervous energy into whatever Tanner pointed him toward. Kieran kept his head down, hoping to avoid confrontation. He'd learned responding only made things worse, and his mother had enough stress without him getting into trouble. But Tanner wasn't one to let entertainment slip away. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Goodwill," Tanner called, using the nickname he'd coined after seeing Kieran's second-hand clothes. "Where'd you get that sweet ride? The junkyard?" Students stopped to watch, some amused, others uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Kieran paused but didn't turn around, his hands clenching before he forced them to relax. His grandfather's voice echoed, "True strength is knowing when not to use it, Kieran. The strongest warrior wins without fighting. Leave him alone, Tanner." The voice belonged to Autumn Reed, Jackson's younger sister, emerging from the library with books. She was everything her brother wasn't: kind, intelligent, genuinely concerned about others. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she fixed Tanner with a disapproving stare. Tanner's expression shifted, becoming predatory. "Oh, I see what's happening. Little Autumn's got a thing for the charity case." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back. "That's cute, but your type usually doesn't go for guys who can't afford decent clothes." Kieran felt something twist in his chest, watching Autumn's cheeks flush with embarrassment and anger. She'd been one of the few students showing him kindness since arriving, helping him find classes and sitting with him in the library when she noticed him eating lunch alone. "My type definitely doesn't include bullies," Autumn shot back, though her voice wavered under the growing crowd's attention. Tanner laughed coldly. "We'll see about that." He looked back at Kieran with renewed interest. "You know what, Goodwill? I think your bike would look better with some custom modifications." Jackson and Braden nodded eagerly, understanding the implied threat. Kieran finally turned around, his dark eyes meeting Tanner's briefly before looking away. "Please just leave it alone," he said quietly. "Please just leave it alone," Tanner mimicked in a high-pitched voice, sending his followers into fresh laughter. "What are you going to do if we don't? Tell on us?" Kieran said nothing, just walked into the building as the first bell rang. Behind him, he could hear Tanner promising Autumn this conversation wasn't over, and the sick feeling in his stomach intensified. The morning passed in its usual blur of classes, where Kieran tried remaining invisible, teachers too busy to notice social dynamics, and moments of tension crossing paths with Tanner's group. By lunch, he'd almost convinced himself maybe Tanner would get bored and move on. He was wrong. After final period, Kieran made his way to the bike rack, already planning the route home that would avoid Tanner's usual hangouts. But as he rounded the gymnasium corner, his steps stopped completely. His bike lay on its side, barely recognizable. The tires were slashed, chain cut, spray paint covering the frame with crude words and drawings. The seat had been removed entirely, and what looked like cafeteria ketchup and mustard had been squirted over everything, creating a sticky, disgusting mess. "Oh no!" Autumn's voice came from behind him, soft with sympathy and outrage. "Kieran, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." He turned to find her standing there with tears in her eyes, and for a moment his careful control threatened to crack. "It's not your fault," he managed to say, though his voice sounded strained. "Of course it is," she said, stepping closer to examine the damage. "Tanner did this because I stood up for you. Because he thinks—" She trailed off, cheeks reddening again. "Because he thinks what?" Kieran asked, though part of him knew the answer. "Because he thinks I like you," she admitted quietly, not meeting his eyes. "And maybe he's not wrong about that." Despite the sick anger churning over his destroyed bike, Kieran felt something warm bloom in his chest. He'd noticed Autumn from his first day, not just because she was beautiful, but because she genuinely cared about people. "I like you too," he said simply, rewarded with a small smile that made the destruction seem less overwhelming. As they left the ruined bike behind and started walking, Kieran thought about his grandfather before leaving Portland. Grandpa Yuki had been born in California, but spent his childhood in internment camps during World War II, shaping his philosophy about when to fight and when to endure. He'd started learning judo as a young man, earning his black belt and opening a small dojo. "There will be times when people will test you," his grandfather had told him during their last training session. "They will push and push, hoping to make you lose control. But remember, Kieran, the goal of judo is not to hurt your opponent. It is to neutralize the threat while maintaining your own balance and dignity." Kieran had been practicing judo since age 7, training almost daily with his grandfather until they'd moved away. His small frame was deceptive. Beneath his quiet exterior was controlled strength and technical skill that could only come from years of dedicated practice. But his grandfather had also taught him that true mastery meant using those skills only when absolutely necessary. The walk home with Autumn was the brightest part of a terrible day. She told him about her college plans for environmental science, her frustration with her brother's friend choices, and her theory that Tanner's behavior stemmed from insecurities about living up to his father's expectations. "You're not like most people," she said as they reached the modest apartment complex where Kieran lived with his mother. "Most guys would have gotten angry and tried to fight back by now." "Would that make you think better of me?" he asked, genuinely curious. She considered seriously. "No, I don't think it would. But I also think there has to be a line somewhere, something that makes you say, 'Enough.'" The next morning brought new humiliation. Kieran had to take the bus to school, immediately marking him as different from students who drove cars or got rides. Tanner was waiting at the bus stop, having clearly planned this encounter. "Look who's riding the loser cruiser now," Tanner announced loudly. "What's wrong, Goodwill? Your bike not working out?" Students laughed, and Kieran felt his cheeks burn as he took a seat toward the front. But Tanner followed onto the bus, sitting directly behind him. "You know what I heard?" Tanner said conversationally, loud enough for surrounding passengers to overhear. "I heard little Autumn Reed thinks she's your girlfriend now. That's pretty funny, considering she could do so much better." The harassment continued throughout the day with increasing boldness. In hallways, Jackson accidentally shoulder-checked Kieran into lockers, sending books scattering. During lunch, Braden knocked over Kieran's water bottle, soaking his homework. But the cruelest moment came in the library, where Kieran had hoped to find peace. Autumn was there working on research, and when she saw him with damaged homework, her face filled with concern. Before Kieran could answer her questions, Tanner appeared, sliding into the seat next to Autumn with confidence that suggested he belonged wherever he chose. "Hey, beautiful," he said, ignoring Kieran. "I was thinking you might want to go to homecoming with someone who can actually afford to rent a tux." Autumn's expression hardened. "I wouldn't go anywhere with you, Tanner." "Come on," Tanner persisted, leaning closer. "You're wasting time with Charity Case here. Everyone knows it. I'm offering you a chance to upgrade." Tanner's easy smile faltered, replaced by something uglier. "You know what? Fine. But don't come crying to me when your little boyfriend disappoints you." Which he will, because that's what losers do. That afternoon, Kieran found himself walking home alone again, having missed the bus while staying after class to redo destroyed homework. The October air was crisp, and the walk gave him too much time to think. He was still thinking when he reached the school parking lot and saw Autumn standing next to a car with tears streaming down her face. Tanner was there too, along with Jackson and Braden, and from their body language, this wasn't friendly conversation. "I told you this morning that you'd come around," Tanner was saying as Kieran approached close enough to hear. "All I'm asking for is one date. Just give me a chance to show you what you're missing." "I said no," Autumn replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "I don't want to go out with you, and I don't appreciate you cornering me like this." Kieran felt something cold settle in his stomach, realizing what was happening. Autumn was trapped between Tanner and her car, with Jackson and Braden positioned to block escape routes. Other students walked past, but none seemed inclined to get involved. She said no. Kieran's voice cut through the afternoon air, quieter than Tanner's but carrying clearly. "You should listen to her." All four turned to look at him, and for a moment nobody moved. Then Tanner's face broke into a grin that was all teeth and no warmth. "Well, look who finally grew a backbone," he said, taking a step toward Kieran. "What are you going to do about it, Goodwill? Fight me?" The question hung loaded with challenge and mockery. Kieran was acutely aware of other students who had stopped to watch, of Autumn's worried expression, of the weight of everything that had built up. His grandfather's voice echoed about balance and dignity, but there was another voice too. Autumn's voice from the day before, talking about lines that shouldn't be crossed. "I'm asking you nicely to leave her alone," Kieran said, his voice steady despite adrenaline coursing through his system. "Please." Tanner laughed again, and this time Jackson and Braden joined in. "Please! Oh, that's rich. You're actually begging me now." He took another step closer, close enough that Kieran could smell his expensive cologne and see cruel amusement dancing in his eyes. "Here's what's going to happen, Goodwill. You're going to turn around and walk away, and I'm going to continue my conversation with Autumn here." "Tanner, stop it," Autumn said, her voice gaining strength. "This is insane. I don't like you. I'm not going to like you, and harassing me isn't going to change that." "Harassing?" Tanner's voice rose slightly, and for the first time, Kieran saw genuine anger replace calculated cruelty. "I'm trying to do you a favor here, Autumn. You think hanging around with this loser is doing your reputation any good?" He gestured dismissively at Kieran, contempt in his voice like a physical blow. "Look at him. Look at his clothes, his attitude, the way he just takes whatever anyone dishes out. Is that really the kind of guy you want to be associated with?" Kieran felt familiar humiliation rise in his chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. A cold, focused anger his grandfather had taught him to recognize and control. The feeling meant he was approaching the edge of self-control, where reaction might override judgment. "You know what I think?" Tanner continued, apparently interpreting Kieran's silence as surrender. "I think you need a reminder of where you stand around here." He reached out and shoved Kieran backward, not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to make him stumble. It was the same casual disrespect he'd been showing for weeks, but this time it felt different. This time, There was an audience that included Autumn, and this time, Kieran had finally found his line. "Don't," Kieran said quietly, straightening up and looking directly into Tanner's eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. Something in his voice or posture must have registered because Tanner's expression shifted slightly. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features. Then his ego reasserted itself, and he shoved Kieran again, harder this time. "Or what?" he demanded. "What are you going to do about it?" The world seemed to slow down as Kieran processed what was happening. He could see the crowd of students that had gathered, some holding phones to record whatever was about to unfold. He could see Autumn's frightened expression, the way she'd pressed herself back against her car. He could see Jackson and Braden positioning themselves to jump in if needed, confident their leader could handle one small, quiet kid. What they couldn't see was the years of training that had shaped Kieran's understanding of balance, leverage, and timing. They couldn't see the countless hours he'd spent learning to read an opponent's movements, to find the exact moment when aggression became vulnerability. They couldn't see his grandfather's patient instruction in principles that turned size and strength into disadvantages when used carelessly. Tanner shoved him a third time, and Kieran moved. The technique was called Sioi Nag, a shoulder throw that used an opponent's forward momentum against them. As Tanner's hands made contact with his chest, Kieran stepped into the movement, turning his body and dropping his center of gravity while his right arm came up under Tanner's arm. For a split second, Tanner was balanced perfectly on Kieran's back, his weight distributed in a way that made him completely helpless. Then Kieran straightened his legs and pulled down with his left hand, and Tanner found himself flying through the air before landing hard on the asphalt. The silence that followed was absolute. Tanner lay on his back, staring up at the sky with complete bewilderment, as if he couldn't process what had just happened. The gathered students seemed equally stunned, their phones still recording, but their faces slack with shock. Kieran stood over him, his breathing steady and posture relaxed despite what had just occurred. "I asked you nicely to leave her alone," he said quietly. "I'm not asking any more." Jackson was the first to recover, charging forward with a wild swing that telegraphed his intentions from halfway across the parking lot. Kieran sidestepped the punch easily and caught Jackson's extended arm, using a simple hip toss to send him tumbling across the ground to land in a heap next to his leader. Braden hesitated, looking between his fallen friends and Kieran's calm expression. The calculation was clearly visible on his face. Whatever had just happened was so far outside his understanding of how these confrontations were supposed to go that he wasn't sure how to respond. "I don't want to fight you," Kieran told him honestly. "But I won't let you hurt her, and I won't let you hurt me anymore either." Tanner was struggling to sit up, his perfect hair disheveled and expensive shirt torn from impact with the ground. How did you?" he stammered, still trying to process what had happened. "I've been training in judo since I was 7, Kieran explained matter-of-factly. "My grandfather taught me that the art isn't about hurting people. It's about neutralizing threats while maintaining your own balance and dignity." He extended a hand to help Tanner up, an offer that was met with a suspicious stare. "I don't want to be your enemy," Kieran continued. "I just want you to leave us alone." Tanner knocked his hand away and struggled to his feet unassisted, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the threat lacked conviction. The absolute ease with which Kieran had handled both him and Jackson had shaken his confidence visibly. "Yes, it is," Kieran replied calmly. "Because if you come after me again, or if you bother Autumn again, I'll defend myself. And next time, I might not be so gentle about it." The word gentle hung in the air like a challenge. Both Tanner and Jackson had been thrown to the ground with what looked like minimal effort, and the implication that Kieran had been holding back was unmistakable. As the three bullies drove away, the crowd of students began to disperse, many casting new and curious glances at Kieran as they went. The shift in their perceptions was almost tangible. The quiet, easily overlooked new kid had just demonstrated that there was much more to him than met the eye. Autumn approached him slowly, her expression mixing admiration with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," he assured her, surprised to realize it was true. The anxiety and helplessness that had been his constant companions for weeks had evaporated, replaced by a sense of calm confidence that felt both foreign and natural. "That was incredible," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My grandfather," Kieran explained as they walked toward her car. "He always told me that the best fight is the one you don't have to finish, but sometimes you have to start it to prevent something worse from happening." The next morning brought dramatic change in Lincoln High School's social ecosystem. Word of the parking lot confrontation had spread overnight, growing in the telling until Kieran had supposedly taken on half the football team and emerged victorious. The reality was more modest, but no less significant. Tanner Mills, the school's most feared bully, had been humbled in front of a crowd by someone he'd dismissed as beneath his notice. Students who had never spoken to Kieran before approached him in hallways, some seeking friendship and others simply wanting to be associated with someone who had achieved the impossible. Teachers who had barely acknowledged his existence suddenly knew his name and made efforts to include him in class discussions. The change was most noticeable in Tanner himself. Gone was the swagger and casual cruelty that had defined his interactions with other students. He still traveled with Jackson and Braden, but the dynamic between them had shifted noticeably. Where once he had led through intimidation and charisma, now there was uncertainty in his movements. 3 days after the incident, Kieran was walking to his locker when he found Tanner waiting for him. For a moment, both boys stood there in silence, and Kieran found himself automatically assessing potential threats before consciously relaxing his stance. "I wanted to..." Tanner began, then stopped and looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Look, what you did the other day. I deserved it." The admission seemed to cost him something, and Kieran could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. "I've been thinking about what you said, about balance and dignity and all that. Maybe I've been doing things wrong." "Maybe we all have," Kieran replied carefully. "It's not too late to change." Tanner nodded slowly, as if the concept of change was something he was still trying to grasp. "Autumn really cares about you, you know. She always has." "I care about her too," Kieran said simply. "Yeah, I can see that." Tanner was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at Kieran for the first time since their confrontation. "I'm sorry. For all of it. The bike, the harassment, the way I treated both of you. It wasn't right." The apology was awkward and clearly difficult for him, but it seemed genuine. Kieran studied his former tormentor's face and saw something there that hadn't been visible before. Vulnerability, uncertainty, and perhaps the beginning of actual self-reflection. "Thank you," Kieran said. "That means something." They parted ways without shaking hands or making grand declarations of friendship, but something had shifted between them. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement and perhaps the foundation for something better. That afternoon, Kieran found Autumn waiting by the bike racks with a surprise. Beside her stood a gleaming mountain bike that looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. "Before you say anything," she said quickly, seeing his expression, "it's not charity. My dad owns a bike shop, and this was a return that we couldn't resell because of a tiny scratch on the frame. I convinced him to let me have it for what we paid wholesale." Kieran walked around the bike, taking in its quality components and professional assembly. It was easily 3 times nicer than his original bike had been. "I can't accept this," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you can. Autumn replied firmly, "because I'm not giving it to you. I'm loaning it to you until you can afford to buy it from me. Consider this a long-term payment plan with very reasonable terms." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell her shampoo and see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Besides, I have ulterior motives. I was hoping my boyfriend might want to go on some bike rides with me." The word boyfriend sent a warm rush through his chest, and Kieran found himself smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. "I think that could be arranged," he said. As they rode home together that evening, taking the long way through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood, Kieran reflected on everything that had changed. The confrontation in the parking lot had lasted less than 30 seconds, but its effects were still rippling outward through his life in ways both large and small. He thought about his grandfather's teachings and realized that he'd learned something new about the concept of balance. It wasn't just about maintaining your center of gravity during a physical technique. It was about finding the equilibrium between standing up for yourself and becoming the very thing you opposed. It was about knowing when to endure and when to act, when to show mercy and when to demonstrate strength. Most importantly, he'd learned that respect wasn't something that could be demanded or taken. It had to be earned through actions that demonstrated character, and once earned, it carried responsibilities that were just as important as the benefits. The halls of Lincoln High School would never be completely free of conflict or cruelty. That was simply the nature of bringing together hundreds of adolescents with their own insecurities and ambitions. But the balance of power had shifted in subtle ways that made life better for those who had previously felt helpless against predators in their midst. And sometimes, Kieran thought, as he watched Autumn laugh at something he'd said, the most important victories were the ones that prevented others from having to fight the same battles you'd faced. His stand against Tanner hadn't just changed his own life. It had demonstrated to every other potential victim that bullies were not invincible, that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, and that sometimes the quiet kid in the corner might be carrying the tools to change everything. As the autumn sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the peaceful suburban streets, Kieran Blackwood pedaled toward home with the knowledge that he'd found his place in this new town after all. It wasn't the place he'd expected when he'd first arrived, but it was one that fit him perfectly. Protector, friend, and living proof that strength comes in many forms, not all of them immediately visible to those who mistake quietness for weakness.